and we are determined to keep those commitments that we made. This bill is part of our delivery of those commitments, and I note that even the opposition recognises how crucial this bill is for our country. Sadly, the member for Melbourne's contribution clearly doesn't understand this so much, and I join with the member for Berowra and others on this side of the House in rejecting some of his remarks. In saying this, I also wish that the member for Melbourne, the Greens and indeed the Labor opposition actually recognised how important our national security priorities are, because this government is carrying out its responsibility to keep Australia safe, but also to make our nation a place with a strong, prosperous economy that enables us to deliver the sort of hope, reward and opportunity that Australians voted for. These objectives are all part of the Coalition's economic action strategy, and we are working to deliver all of our commitments because we know that only a stronger economy will generate more jobs, lift living standards and give our country a better future. And it's worth, Mr Deputy Speaker, to go briefly through some of the steps that we've taken in this strategy in 2014, because this year has genuinely been one of achievement. To start with, Labor's jobs-destroying carbon tax is gone, saving the average household around $550 a year, particularly the average household on the Central Coast, and we've delivered the biggest cut in electricity prices on record. For our families saving for Christmas on the Central Coast, this is good news. The mining tax is gone, so this vital sector can help create more jobs. We also took on the responsibility of fixing Labor's budget mess, and we're getting spending under control. We've passed our direct action plan, which will make a practical difference to the environment without slugging families with a carbon tax. Our $12 billion infrastructure program is already underway to save people time and money, including on major projects like NorthConnex, which will benefit people in my electorate on the Central Coast. The M1, M2 missing link will save around 15 minutes each way for the 40,000 commuters who leave early in the morning and return late home at night to their families because their job opportunities are in Sydney. And this will generate around, and the missing link will generate around 8,700 full-time equivalent jobs every year during construction, scheduled to start next year. We're cutting red tape with $2 billion in red tape savings already identified. We're turbocharging trade with our neighbours by delivering free trade agreements with Japan, Korea and China, which means more exports, more jobs and lower prices for families. And we're working with businesses to ensure we're taking advantages of these opportunities.
In fact, just last week— going to start to get towards somewhere near the bill?
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I will do so. Crucially, Mr Deputy Speaker, we are keeping Australia safe. More than 50,000 illegal boat people arrived on Labor's watch, creating an $11.6 billion blowout in border protection costs. Now we've all but stopped the boats, which many claimed was impossible, and as we see in this bill now before the House, we have responded to the threat of extremism with new counter-terrorism measures. This government will do everything possible to keep people safe. Our security measures at home and abroad are directed against terrorism, not religion, and Australians should always live normally because terrorists' goal is to scare people. These are three important principles that this government has enunciated. Mr Deputy Speaker, this government is putting these messages into action in a number of ways. This includes providing an additional $630 million to give our police, intelligence and security services the resources they need. There are now stronger measures at international airports and many public buildings to deter extremists, and we're also urgently updating counter-terrorism legislation. The Foreign Fighters Bill, which was assented to by this Parliament on the 3rd of November, fills the most pressing gaps and will tailor many of our existing powers and offences to address the new threat of homegrown terrorism. Mr Deputy Speaker, the terrorist methods have changed, so our legislation needs to change too. We are facing a new kind of terrorist, different to the 9/11 generation, and of course we will never forget those attacks. It's also 12 years since we were rocked by the tragedy of the Bali bombings, which were a shocking attack on Australians. As a nation, we are aware of the long-term damage that this can have. But we also face a new threat from a new generation of evil. We are battling the threat of homegrown lone wolf attackers. These terrorists, often teenagers inspired and directed by ISIL and other groups reaching out from afar, are becoming self-radicalised online. They aren't and often don't have the ability or knowledge to be planning the sort of attacks that we witnessed in horror at the World Trade Center. Now we're faced with the threat of simple, low-tech attacks which require little preparation, training or capability. So by understanding that terrorists are changing the way they act, it's up to Australia to adapt by updating our counter-terrorism legislation. In short, we must have strong laws to deal with this threat, which the Prime Minister has aptly described as a death cult. And that's what we're doing in this bill. We need to act. We are seeking to address urgent needs that have been identified by our intelligence, defence and law enforcement agencies, which includes the deployment of the Australian Defence Force to undertake military operations against the ISIL death cult in Iraq. And it includes the recent Operation Appleby, which disrupted an alleged terrorist attack in Sydney. We have been working to improve this legislation, Mr Deputy Speaker. These measures are not targeted at any religion or community. In fact, as the member for Ryan said earlier in this place, in an ideal world we would not even need this bill. But as this government and most Australians know, we must be prepared and responsible in these serious matters. So I take the opportunity to commend the work of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. The committee made 16 unanimous recommendations, including, most importantly, that the bill be passed. And I'm pleased to confirm again to the House that, following consultation with all relevant agencies, the government has decided to accept or accept in principle all of the recommendations in the report. Importantly, the final recommendation of the PJCIS is that the bill be passed. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd like to touch on some of these recommendations today that underline just how important it is that we respond to our rapidly changing global environment. One of the recommendations we're endorsing is the requirement for the Australian Federal Police to provide a statement of facts when seeking an interim control order from the Attorney-General. This is recommendation 3 from the committee, from Schedule 1 of the Criminal Code Act 1995 amendments. The bill currently requires the Australian Federal Police to provide the Attorney-General with a draft of the interim control order to be requested, information about the person's age and a summary of the grounds on which the order should be made. The bill will be amended so that the Australian Federal Police must now also provide a statement of facts about why the order should or should not be made. And at this point, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd also like to commend the Australian Federal Police. The arrest of 6 men in Sydney on the weekend for drug importation was the second largest drug seizure in Australia's history. The joint organised crime group, including the Australian Federal Police, the New South Wales Police, Australian Customs and Border Protection Service, the State Crime Commission and the Australian Crime Commission, stopped almost 2.8 tonnes of MDMA and methamphetamine with a street value in excess of $1.5 billion. It's put a major dent in the operations of organised crime in Australia and importantly has made sure these drugs did not reach our streets. Potentially thousands of lives have been saved, including potentially people in my electorate, as a result of this excellent work. Only last week the Salvation Army actually highlighted the increased use of the drug ice on the Central Coast, and I'm pleased to have this opportunity just for a moment to thank our law enforcement agencies for their work in getting these drugs out of the hands of dealers and traffickers. Mr Deputy Speaker, when we hear about these seizures, it brings threats close to home. Importantly, this bill that we are speaking on today enhances and improves the ability of law enforcement and intelligence agencies to respond to threats through necessary and urgent amendments to national security legislation. This bill underlines how we are serious about enhancing the control of the Australian Federal Police and to streamline the application process. Under this bill, we're facilitating the Australian Secret Intelligence Service when it's supporting and cooperating with the Australian Defence Force on military operations. And we are enhancing the arrangements for the provision of emergency ministerial authorisations to intelligence agencies to undertake activities. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd like to touch on another recommendation that will help to keep Australia safe by lowering the terror threat at home and abroad. Recommendation 2 of Schedule 1 describes how the term supports and facilitates should be based on language in the existing criminal code. The criminal code uses these terms but does not define them. That is, the terms have their ordinary meaning and they're appropriately left for the courts to determine. And that is exactly how the terms are treated in the bill. Recommendation 6 will also assist in this package of amendments to help keep Australia safe. As part of this bill, It will allow the Australian Federal Police to request and issue a court to make a control order in relation to those who enable and those who recruit. Although these individuals may not directly participate in terrorist acts, by providing funds and equipment or by recruiting vulnerable young people to champion their cause and even, sadly, to die for it, is instrumental to carrying out acts of terror. Contrary to some inaccurate reporting, these amendments will not enable ACEs to kill Australians or others. Their role is to provide intelligence support to the ADF. In short, Mr Deputy Speaker, the government must ensure the Australian Defence Force is in the best position to protect its personnel, and this measure helps achieve this objective. I'm pleased to be advised that all of the existing safeguards and oversight mechanisms in the Intelligence Services Act 2001 will continue to apply, and I understand that strong oversight mechanisms will also apply to the arrangements for emergency ministerial authorisations. Finally, and I do thank the committee for its exhaustive time in going through each recommendation in such detail, I would like to also highlight Recommendation 1, which is the appointment of the National Security Legislation Monitor. The government will also task the newly appointed monitor to consider whether the additional safeguards recommended in the 2013 Council of Australian Government's review of counter-terrorism legislation should be introduced. The government firmly supports independent oversight of national security and counter-terrorism legislation and accepts the urgency to appoint this monitor. In conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, this is a bill that is part of our commitment to build a safe and secure Australia. It is our obligation and our duty to keep Australia as safe as humanly possible, and in times like these, when we need to make tough, important decisions for our future, it is an honour, Mr Deputy Speaker, to commend this bill to the House.